When Daniel Carter signed the foreclosure papers on the old Brennan Foundry for $580, the county clerk stared at him like he'd just purchased his own tombstone. The building hadn't cast steel in 19 years, its furnaces cold as graves, its machinery locked in rust, its roof sagging under the weight of too many Pennsylvania winters. But Daniel wasn't buying potential. He was buying shelter for himself and his 9-year-old son, Lucas, because the rent on their apartment was 5 weeks overdue and his welding contracts had evaporated when the automotive plant across the state line shuttered its doors. Sometimes desperation wears the mask of opportunity if you're desperate enough to believe it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel stood in the gravel lot of the foundry on a gray November afternoon, his truck's diesel engine ticking as it cooled. Lucas pressed against his father's side despite the cold, small hands buried in jacket pockets. The building loomed before them like something from another century, 4 stories of blackened brick and shattered windows, surrounded by acres of cracked concrete where mountains of coal and scrap metal had once stood. A faded sign still clung to the main entrance, letters barely visible through decades of industrial grime, Brennan Iron Works, established 1898. The name meant nothing to Daniel, just another piece of forgotten history in a valley full of them. Lucas's grip tightened on his father's coat. It looks like a haunted house. Daniel couldn't argue with that assessment. The foundry looked like exactly what it was, abandoned, possibly dangerous, and definitely not the kind of place a responsible parent would bring a child to live. But responsibility was a luxury he could no longer afford. The math was brutally simple, $580 for the building versus $950 a month for the cramped apartment they'd been calling home. The foundry had 4 walls and a mostly intact roof. That made it a palace compared to the alternative, which was his truck bed. "It's just old," Daniel said, injecting confidence he didn't feel into his voice. "Old doesn't mean bad. Old means they built it to last. They made things solid back then." Lucas looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding for 9 years old. He'd developed that look over the past 3 years, since his mother, Jennifer, had died in the accident on Route 22. A semi-truck had crossed the median during an ice storm. The state trooper who'd knocked on their door at 2 in the morning had used words like instantaneous and no suffering, as if those phrases could soften the reality that Lucas's mother was never coming home. Daniel had stopped trying to find comfort in those words. Some losses couldn't be softened, only survived. The county clerk had given Daniel a single key, ancient brass, worn smooth by decades of use. It felt heavy in his palm as he approached the main entrance, a massive iron door that had probably been magnificent once but now hung slightly crooked on hinges crusted with oxidation. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, and the door swung open with a groan that echoed through the cavernous space beyond. The interior smelled of dust, machine oil, and something metallic that Daniel recognized from his years working with steel, the scent of iron oxide, of metal breaking down over time. What little November light filtered through the grimy windows revealed a vast open space filled with silent machinery. Massive crucibles, overhead cranes, conveyor systems, and metalworking equipment stood frozen mid-operation, as if the workers had simply walked away one day and never returned. Which, Daniel suspected, was probably close to the truth. Lucas stayed close to his side as they explored, their footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. The main foundry floor occupied most of the ground level, cathedral ceilings lost in shadows above, metal catwalks crisscrossing the upper reaches like skeletal ribs. Iron stairs led to a second floor where offices had once operated, their doors hanging open to reveal rooms filled with abandoned filing cabinets and desks buried under years of dust and scattered paperwork. "Can we really live here?" Lucas asked quietly, his voice sounding small in the massive space. Daniel surveyed their new home with what he hoped looked like optimism. "We'll make it work. See that office up there? The one with the big window overlooking the floor? We'll clean it out, set up our beds. I can rig up some heating, get the electricity turned on. It'll be different, but different can be good." "I don't want different anymore," Lucas said softly. The words hit Daniel harder than his son probably intended. Lucas used to embrace change, before Jennifer died, before the contracts dried up, before their life became a series of increasingly desperate compromises. Lucas had been adventurous, curious, fearless in the way children are when they trust the world won't hurt them. Now he flinched at uncertainty, clung to routine, and looked at the world through eyes that expected disappointment. Daniel knelt down to his level, his knees protesting against the cold concrete. "I know things have been hard, buddy. I know you didn't ask for any of this. But I promise you, we're going to be okay. This place might not look like much now, but it's ours. Nobody can evict us. Nobody can raise the rent. We just need to make it livable." Lucas studied his face with that too perceptive gaze. "You promise?" Daniel had learned the hard way that promises to children carried weight you couldn't always bear. But what else could he offer? "I promise we'll try our hardest." It wasn't much of a promise, but it was honest. Lucas seemed to accept it, nodding slightly before turning his attention back to exploring their strange new home. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They spent the remaining daylight hours doing basic reconnaissance. Daniel tested light switches, finding to his relief that the electricity still functioned, though several fixtures had burned out bulbs and exposed wiring that would need immediate attention. The plumbing proved more problematic. Water flowed when he turned on a rusted faucet in what had been the facility's bathroom, but it ran brown for several minutes before clearing to a murky amber. The toilet functioned, which Daniel counted as a significant victory, even if the porcelain was stained beyond recognition. The upper floors revealed more offices, a break room with a refrigerator that had become an ecosystem of mold, and storage areas packed with boxes of old paperwork and supplies. Daniel made mental notes of what could be salvaged: cleaning supplies, some basic hand tools, even a few metal chairs that might be serviceable once the rust was scrubbed away. In one storage room, he found stacks of safety equipment, hard hats, welding masks, leather aprons, relics from when this place had hummed with human activity and purpose. As the winter sun began its early descent, Daniel started hauling their possessions from the truck. They didn't have much: 2 duffel bags of clothes, a box of Lucas's books and toys, his welding equipment and tool bag, sleeping bags and blankets, a portable propane heater, and a cooler with the perishable food they'd managed to salvage from the apartment. It took 4 trips to get everything inside, each one emphasizing just how little they'd accumulated in 9 years of Lucas's life. He chose the largest office on the 2nd floor for their living space. It had windows facing east, which would catch the morning sun, and a door that still closed properly, complete with a working lock. Daniel swept out the worst of the dust and debris, then laid out their sleeping bags on the floor. The propane heater went in one corner, positioned safely away from anything flammable. Their food supplies went in another. Lucas arranged his toys on the windowsill with careful precision, creating order in the chaos: action figures lined up by size, books stacked by height, a small stuffed rabbit his mother had given him positioned in the center like a guardian. "It's like camping," Daniel offered, watching his son create his small kingdom of familiar objects. "Camping is supposed to be temporary," Lucas replied without looking up. Daniel didn't have a response to that. Instead, he focused on practical tasks. Heating would be the immediate challenge. The foundry had ancient radiators throughout, connected to a boiler system that Daniel suspected hadn't functioned in years. For tonight, the propane heater would at least keep their room from freezing. Tomorrow, he'd investigate the boiler situation and determine whether it could be salvaged or if he'd need to devise alternative heating solutions before the real Pennsylvania cold set in. They ate dinner sitting on the floor of their new room, sandwiches made from supplies Daniel had picked up at the gas station on their way into town. Lucas chewed slowly, his eyes wandering around the bare office walls. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, turning the windows into black mirrors that reflected the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. "Tell me about Mom," Lucas said suddenly. The request surprised Daniel. Lucas rarely asked about Jennifer anymore. The first year after the accident, Lucas had asked constantly, "Where was Mom?" Was she watching them from heaven? Did she know they missed her? Daniel had fumbled through explanations that satisfied neither of them, eventually settling on variations of "she's at peace now and she'll always be with us in our hearts." After a while, Lucas stopped asking. Daniel had thought that meant acceptance. Now he wondered if it had just been retreat. "What do you want to know?" Daniel asked carefully. Lucas picked at his sandwich. "Do you think she'd be mad we're living here?" The question cut deeper than Daniel expected. Would Jennifer be angry? Disappointed? Heartbroken that their son was sleeping on the floor of an abandoned foundry instead of in a proper home with proper heat and proper food? Or would she understand that Daniel was doing everything he could with what little remained? "Your mom understood that sometimes life doesn't go according to plan," Daniel said slowly. "She grew up in a house smaller than this office, you know. Her dad worked construction, and there were times when money was tight. She told me once that home isn't about the building you're in. It's about the people you're with." Lucas absorbed this quietly. "I miss her." "Me too, buddy. Every single day." They finished dinner in comfortable silence. Daniel cleaned up their minimal dishes while Lucas prepared for bed, changing into his pajamas and brushing his teeth in the cold bathroom down the hall. When he returned, Daniel tucked him into his sleeping bag and read to him from one of the books they'd brought, a battered copy of Hatchet that had been Lucas's favorite before everything changed. Lucas fell asleep halfway through the chapter, his breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of childhood rest. Daniel continued reading softly for a few more minutes, reluctant to stop this small piece of normalcy. Finally, he closed the book and simply sat there, watching his son sleep in their strange new home. The foundry made sounds at night. Metal creaking, structure settling, the wind finding its way through gaps in the walls. Normal sounds for an old building, Daniel told himself, even as they raised the hairs on the back of his neck. He'd grown up in suburban developments and rental houses, not sprawling industrial relics. The sheer size of the place, the echoing spaces below, the shadows that pressed against their small island of light, all of it felt overwhelming in the darkness. Daniel checked the propane heater to make sure it was functioning safely, adjusting the flame to maintain a steady temperature without burning through their limited fuel supply too quickly. Then he settled into his own sleeping bag, positioned between Lucas and the door, a father's instinct to place himself between his child and whatever dangers might emerge from the darkness. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds and the hard floor beneath him. At some point in the early morning hours, exhaustion finally won. He woke to pale winter light filtering through the dirty windows and Lucas already awake, sitting cross-legged on his sleeping bag and drawing in his notebook. Daniel had bought him that notebook and a pack of colored pencils 4 months ago, back when he'd still had steady welding work. Lucas had filled half of it already with elaborate drawings of imaginary machines, fantastical contraptions that combined elements he'd seen in Daniel's workshop with pure invention. "Morning, kiddo," Daniel said, his voice rough from sleep in the cold air. "Morning," Lucas replied without looking up from his drawing. "The building makes weird sounds at night. Old places do that. It's just the metal settling, the temperature changing. Nothing to worry about." Lucas nodded but didn't look convinced. Daniel couldn't blame him. In daylight, the foundry looked less menacing but no more welcoming. Just old, vast, and fundamentally empty. Daniel made them a basic breakfast on the propane stove, instant oatmeal and coffee for himself, the ritual of morning preparation helping restore some sense of normalcy. As they ate, he outlined his plan for the day. First priority was getting the boiler system evaluated. If it could be repaired, they'd have heat throughout the building. If not, he'd need to figure out alternative heating solutions before the real winter cold arrived. Second priority was making their living space more habitable, deep cleaning, finding or building proper furniture, maybe hanging some plastic sheeting over the windows to block drafts. "Can I explore while you work?" Lucas asked. Daniel hesitated. The foundry was large, potentially dangerous with its old machinery and questionable structural integrity. But keeping Lucas confined to one office seemed cruel, and he couldn't watch him constantly while trying to assess the building's systems. You can explore the second floor, Daniel compromised. But you stay away from the machinery downstairs, and you stay where I can hear you if you call. Deal? Deal, Lucas agreed readily. They spent the morning in parallel tasks. Daniel descended to the boiler room, a dark cave beneath the main foundry floor accessed by a narrow staircase that groaned alarmingly under his weight. The boiler itself was a monster from another era, a massive cast iron beast covered in a maze of pipes and pressure gauges frozen in time. Daniel knew industrial systems from his welding work, but this antique equipment was beyond his immediate expertise. He'd need to call on a specialist, which meant money he didn't have. Meanwhile, Lucas's footsteps echoed overhead as he wandered the second-floor offices. Occasionally, he'd call down to his father, reporting his discoveries: an office with blueprints still pinned to the walls, a storage room full of old-time cards, a break room with a calendar frozen on September 2005. Daniel was examining the boiler's ancient control panel, trying to determine what might be salvageable, when Lucas's voice cut through the building with unusual urgency. "Dad! Dad, come quick!" Daniel was up the stairs faster than he thought possible, heart hammering. Lucas's tone hadn't been panic exactly, but something close. He found his son standing in front of a wall at the far end of the second-floor hallway, an expanse of dark brick that looked identical to the rest of the building's interior. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked, scanning for danger. "Nothing's wrong," Lucas said, his eyes bright with excitement. "But look at this." He pressed his hand against what appeared to be solid brick, and a section of the wall swung inward with a soft click, revealing a narrow doorway Daniel would have sworn wasn't there moments before. "It's a secret door," Lucas whispered, as if speaking loudly might close it again. "I was leaning against the wall trying to see out the window, and I felt something move." Daniel approached cautiously, examining the mechanism. The door was cleverly designed, nearly invisible when closed, operated by a hidden catch disguised as a slightly protruding brick. Beyond the doorway, darkness suggested a space larger than a simple storage closet. "Stay here," Daniel instructed Lucas. He pulled out his phone, activating its flashlight function, and stepped through the hidden door. The room beyond was roughly 15 feet square, windowless, and completely concealed within the building's structure. As Daniel's phone light swept across the space, it revealed something that made his breath catch. The room was furnished. A heavy oak desk dominated one wall, its surface clear except for a leather-bound journal. Metal shelves lined another wall, filled with what appeared to be ledgers and files. But what commanded Daniel's attention was the opposite wall, where a large portrait hung in an ornate frame. The painting showed a man in his 60s, dressed in the formal style of the early 20th century. He sat in a leather chair with one hand resting on the arm, his expression stern and unyielding. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plate bore an inscription Daniel had to step closer to read: Harrison Brennan, 1871–1947. Founder, Brennan Iron Works. "What is it?" Lucas called from the doorway, unable to contain his curiosity. "It's a hidden office," Daniel said slowly. "I think it belonged to the man who built this place." Lucas slipped past him despite his earlier instruction to stay put, his eyes wide as he took in the secret room. Why would someone hide their office? It was a good question. Daniel had no answer. He moved to the desk, examining it more closely. The wood was dark with age but well maintained, as if someone had cared for it right up until the building's abandonment. The leather journal sat centered on the desk surface, its cover pristine despite the dust covering everything else in the building. Daniel reached for it, then hesitated. Something about this felt significant, like opening that journal would cross a threshold he couldn't uncross. Which was ridiculous, it was just an old book in an abandoned building he'd legally purchased. He opened the journal. The first page contained a single line of text, written in precise, old-fashioned script: "For the one who finds this, having purchased what others abandoned, you've earned the right to know what they never did." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he turned to the next page, where detailed entries began. Not business records, as he'd expected, but something else entirely: instructions, locations, and descriptions that made his vision blur as he tried to process what he was reading. "Dad?" Lucas's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you okay?" Daniel looked up from the journal to his son's concerned face, then back down to the page before him. The page that contained directions to 5 different locations on the foundry property. The page that listed, in precise detail, assets hidden over decades by a man who'd apparently trusted no one with his fortune. Harrison Brennan had died 77 years ago. And if this journal was to be believed, he'd left behind something worth far more than $580. Daniel spent the next 4 hours locked in that hidden room while Lucas sat cross-legged on the floor outside, entertaining himself with his notebook and colored pencils. The journal contained 93 pages of Harrison Brennan's careful handwriting, each entry dated and detailed with the precision of a man who'd built an empire from molten iron and determination. What Daniel read rewrote everything he thought he understood about the property he'd purchased for less than 2 months' rent. Harrison Brennan hadn't trusted banks. That much became clear within the first dozen pages. The man had lived through the panic of 1907, watched neighbors lose everything to institutions they believed were safe. So he'd created his own security, systematically hiding portions of his wealth across the foundry property in 5 separate locations. War bonds, Liberty bonds from the First World War, Victory bonds from the Second. Bonds that had been meant to finance America's wars and were now, according to Harrison's meticulous notes, hidden beneath the very ground Daniel walked on. The journal provided maps, measurements from permanent landmarks, depth specifications. Everything needed to recover what Harrison had called his legacy insurance. Each cache was documented with the same methodical care, the northeastern corner, 18 feet from the old coal bin's foundation. The southern yard, 12 feet east of the iron gate post. Precise, deliberate, impossible to stumble upon by accident. The final entry was dated April 3, 1947, 3 weeks before Harrison's death according to the brass plate beneath his portrait. His handwriting had grown shakier, but remained legible. "My son believes this business is his birthright, earned through blood alone rather than character or commitment. He has no understanding of what built this foundry. No respect for the men who labored in the heat and danger. No vision beyond his own comfort and status. I have made provisions. Let the land decide who is worthy of what I've built. Let time separate the patient from the entitled. Whoever finds this will have purchased what my son will surely abandon. May you prove worthier than my blood." Daniel read that final entry 3 times, trying to parse the bitterness in those words, a father disinheriting his son not through legal channels, but through concealment and time. Harrison had apparently left the foundry to his son in his will, along with the house and the contracts. But the wealth he'd accumulated, the foundation of everything he'd built, that he'd hidden away, with instructions only discoverable by someone who actually occupied the property long enough to stumble upon its secrets. The son had clearly sold everything off eventually. The dates on the abandoned paperwork suggested the foundry had operated sporadically through the 1960s before closing permanently around 2005. 58 years of the Brennan family slowly liquidating their inheritance without ever finding what really mattered. And now that inheritance belonged to Daniel Carter, a 34-year-old welder who'd bought the property in desperation, not ambition. The numbers in the journal were staggering. Harrison had been specific about quantities: $50,000 in Liberty bonds from 1917. $75,000 in Victory bonds from 1945. Even accounting for the fact that some bonds might have deteriorated or been discovered over time, Daniel was potentially looking at bonds that had matured over decades, accumulating interest that could transform them into serious wealth. He'd need to research current redemption values, but his rough mental math suggested he might be looking at enough money to fundamentally change his and Lucas's lives. If it was real. If Harrison hadn't been delusional. If the caches hadn't already been found by urban explorers or previous owners. If the landmarks referenced in the maps still existed after 77 years. If Daniel could actually locate and excavate the hiding spots without drawing attention or legal complications. Too many ifs. But also, what choice did he have? The journal was either legitimate or it wasn't. The only way to know was to look. Daniel emerged from the hidden room to find Lucas had drawn an elaborate picture of the secret door, complete with mysterious shadows and a treasure chest glowing in the darkness beyond. He looked up as his father stepped out, his expression curious but patient. "Did you find treasure?" he asked. The question was so direct it startled a laugh from Daniel. "Maybe. I found a very old journal with some interesting information. I need to do some investigating to know if it means anything. Can I help investigate?" Daniel considered this. He'd need to survey the property, identify the landmarks Harrison had referenced, possibly start excavating. Some of that work Lucas could participate in safely. And honestly, the idea of having company while he pursued what might be an elaborate wild goose chase appealed to him. "Yeah," Daniel said. "You can help. But first, we need to get some supplies." They drove into Millridge, the nearest town of any size, with the journal locked in Daniel's truck's glove compartment. The town center consisted of one main street lined with businesses that had clearly seen better days: a hardware store, a diner, a dollar store, a bar called The Forge that probably served as the community's social hub. Daniel parked outside the hardware store, a place called Patterson's that looked like it had been there since Harrison Brennan's time. The interior smelled of sawdust, metal, and oil, a scent Daniel found oddly comforting. An older man stood behind the counter, his weathered face and calloused hands marking him as someone who'd done more than just sell tools over his lifetime. "Help you find something?" the man asked. Daniel had prepared a mental list: shovels, a good flashlight, work gloves, a metal detector if they had one. Equipment that could serve multiple purposes but would primarily help him search for Harrison's hidden caches. "Need some excavation supplies," Daniel said. "Shovels, maybe a pickaxe. And I'm looking for a metal detector if you carry them." The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "You the fellow who bought the old Brennan Foundry?" News traveled fast in small towns. Daniel shouldn't have been surprised. "That's me. Daniel Carter." "Ray Patterson," the man said, extending a hand that engulfed Daniel's in a grip that still held considerable strength despite his age. "My father worked at that foundry back in the 30s and 40s. Said it was the best job in the county back then. Harrison Brennan paid fair wages, ran a safe operation. Treated his men like human beings, not just labor." Daniel felt a strange connection to the portrait hanging in that hidden room. "What happened to it?" "To the company?" Ray's expression soured. "Harrison's son, Victor. That's what happened. Man inherited a thriving business and ran it into the ground through pure negligence and arrogance. Refused to modernize equipment, too expensive. Refused to invest in new contracts, too much effort. Treated workers like they should be grateful for whatever scraps he threw them. By the time Victor died in the 70s, most of the good contracts had gone elsewhere. His own son, Harrison's grandson, kept it limping along part-time until the economy tanked. Then he just walked away. Left everything to rot." The story aligned with what Daniel had read in Harrison's final journal entry. A legacy squandered by entitled heirs who'd never understood what built it. "Well," Daniel said, "I'm hoping to make something of the place. Starting small, but who knows?" Ray studied him with an assessing gaze. "What exactly are you planning to excavate?" Daniel had anticipated this question and prepared a plausible cover story. Previous owners left a lot of junk buried around the property. Old equipment, scrap metal. Figured I'd dig it up, sell what I can for scrap, clean the place up. Ray nodded slowly, accepting this explanation. "Metal detectors are over here. Got a good one, professional grade. Cost you, though." The detector was $280, more than Daniel had budgeted, but necessary if he was going to locate metal caches buried underground. He added 2 shovels, work gloves, and a heavy-duty flashlight to his purchases. The total came to $385, leaving Daniel with less than $150 to his name until he could find welding work. As Ray rang up the purchase, he said casually, "You know, there's been stories about that foundry for years. Folks say old Harrison hid money all over the property before he died." Urban legend type stuff, but the stories persist. Daniel kept his expression neutral. People say that about a lot of old places. Usually just wishful thinking. Usually, Ray agreed. But Harrison Brennan wasn't like most people. Man survived 2 financial panics by being smarter and more careful than everyone around him. Wouldn't surprise me if the stories had some truth to them. Daniel loaded his purchases into his truck, hyper-aware of the journal in his glove compartment. If there were already rumors about hidden wealth at the foundry, he'd need to be careful. The last thing he needed was treasure hunters or opportunistic locals taking an interest in his activities. Lucas had waited patiently in the truck, and now he eyed the equipment with interest. "Are we going treasure hunting?" "We're going investigating," Daniel corrected gently. "Big difference. Treasure hunting is about getting rich quick. Investigating is about carefully seeing if something might be true." Back at the foundry, Daniel spread Harrison's maps across the desk in the hidden room, comparing them to the current property layout. The first cache was supposedly buried near what the journal called the northeastern marker, the foundation corner of the old coal storage bin. Daniel had noticed the crumbling remains of that structure during his initial survey, a concrete foundation probably weighing several tons, old enough to have been there in Harrison's time, distinctive enough to serve as a permanent landmark. The map indicated the cache was buried 16 feet due south of the foundation's southeastern corner, at a depth of 5 feet. If the measurements were accurate, and if the cache hadn't been disturbed, Daniel was looking at an excavation that would take several hours but wasn't impossibly difficult. He and Lucas walked the property as the winter afternoon light began to fade, Daniel carrying the metal detector and Lucas helping him measure distances with a tape measure they'd found in one of the storage rooms. The coal bin foundation sat in an area that had probably once been cleared but was now overgrown with dead weeds and small saplings pushing through the cracked concrete. Daniel marked the spot Harrison's measurements indicated, then swept the metal detector over it. The device shrieked immediately, its readout indicating significant metal presence at approximately 5 feet down. Daniel's heart rate accelerated. It could be anything: old equipment, buried scrap metal, exactly what he'd told Ray Patterson he expected to find. But the location was too precise, the depth too exact to Harrison's specifications. This was no coincidence. "Is there treasure there?" Lucas asked, watching his father's face. "There's definitely something metal buried there," Daniel said carefully. "Tomorrow, when we have good light, we'll dig and see what it is." That night, Daniel lay awake in his sleeping bag long after Lucas had fallen asleep, his mind racing through possibilities and complications. If the cache contained what Harrison's journal suggested, Daniel was looking at a life-changing discovery. But found wealth came with questions: legal questions about ownership, tax questions about windfall income, practical questions about how to convert old war bonds into usable money without attracting dangerous attention. And moral questions, too. Harrison had hidden this wealth intentionally, creating a system that rewarded patience and occupancy over blood inheritance. His descendants had apparently never found it, had sold off the property without knowing its true value. Did that make the caches Daniel's by right of purchase? Or was he morally obligated to track down Harrison's living heirs and inform them of their grandfather's hidden legacy? Marcus knew what the law would likely say: he'd purchased the property and everything on it. Found assets on private property belonged to the property owner. But law and morality didn't always align, and Daniel had been raised by parents who'd valued doing right over doing well. He still hadn't resolved these questions when exhaustion finally pulled him under sometime after midnight. Morning arrived with frost on the windows and Lucas already awake, dressed and clearly ready for their excavation project. Daniel made them breakfast, checked the weather forecast, clear and cold, and gathered their tools. The digging proved harder than anticipated. The ground was half frozen, resistant to the shovel's blade. Daniel worked steadily, breaking through the top layer of frozen earth to reach the softer soil beneath. Lucas helped by clearing away the dirt his father excavated, piling it neatly to one side. 3 hours of digging brought them to a depth of 4 feet. Daniel's back ached, his hands were blistered despite the gloves, and doubt had begun creeping in. Maybe the metal detector had picked up old equipment. Maybe Harrison's map was deliberately misleading, a final joke on whoever might find it. Then his shovel struck something solid with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty property. Daniel dropped to his knees at the bottom of the hole, using his gloved hands to brush away soil from what his shovel had hit. Metal emerged, a box, pitted with rust but intact. Maybe 2 feet long and 18 inches wide, constructed from heavy steel with reinforced corners. No lock, just a simple latched lid. "Is that it?" Lucas called from above, leaning over the edge of the hole. "Is that the treasure?" Daniel lifted the box carefully. It was heavy, substantial in a way that suggested contents beyond empty metal. He climbed out of the hole and set the box on level ground, Lucas crowding close to see. The latch resisted briefly, rust and time making it stubborn, then gave way with a squeal of protest. Daniel lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had survived 77 years underground, were stacks of paper certificates. War bonds, just as Harrison had documented. Liberty bonds with ornate printing and official seals. Victory bonds with patriotic imagery. Daniel counted quickly, dozens of them, maybe more beneath the top layer. Each bond represented money loaned to the government decades ago, money that had been earning interest all this time. "Daddy," Lucas whispered, his eyes huge. "We're rich?" Daniel stared at the bonds, his mind trying to calculate their potential value. He'd need to research redemption procedures, current values, tax implications. But even conservative estimates suggested he was looking at enough money to change their lives fundamentally. "We need to be very careful," Daniel said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "We can't tell anyone about this." "Not yet. Not until I figure out what we're supposed to do." Lucas nodded seriously, understanding in his own 9-year-old way that this changed everything. "It's our secret." "Our secret," Daniel agreed. He reburied the box, marking the location carefully so he could retrieve it later, and filled in the hole. No point leaving evidence of their discovery visible to anyone who might wander the property. Then he and Lucas returned to the foundry, Daniel's mind churning through implications and possibilities. That evening, after Lucas was asleep, Daniel researched war bonds and inheritance law on his phone. The legal situation seemed clear enough. He'd purchased the property through legitimate foreclosure proceedings. Assets found on the property belonged to him. Harrison Brennan's heirs had owned the land for decades and sold it off without discovering what lay beneath. Their loss, legally speaking. But Marcus kept coming back to Harrison's final entry. The bitterness of a father disappointed in his son. The deliberate construction of a system that would only reward someone who actually lived on and worked the property. Harrison hadn't wanted his son to have this wealth. He'd engineered things specifically to prevent it. Daniel had stumbled into Harrison's trap, but a trap designed to catch someone worthy, not exclude the unworthy. The question was, did that make him worthy? He was just a guy who'd run out of options and bought the cheapest roof he could find. Did that qualify him for a windfall that could solve every problem he'd ever faced? His phone rang, startling him in the quiet office. Unknown number, local area code. Daniel answered cautiously. Daniel Carter, a woman's voice, professional, clipped. "My name is Victoria Brennan Walsh. I understand you recently purchased the Brennan Foundry property." Daniel's stomach dropped. Brennan. A descendant. Calling him the same day he'd found Harrison's first cash. The coincidence was too precise to be accidental. "That's right," Daniel said carefully. "Can I help you with something?" "I'd like to meet with you," Victoria said. "Discuss the property, its history. I'm Harrison Brennan's great-granddaughter. My family has some interest in the site's historical preservation." Historical preservation, code for searching for Harrison's rumored hidden wealth, most likely. Ray Patterson's casual mention of the legends suddenly seemed less innocent. Word had spread that someone new owned the foundry, and now Harrison's descendants were circling. "I'm not looking to sell," Daniel said. "I'm not looking to buy," Victoria countered smoothly. "Just to talk. I'm in town tomorrow. Perhaps we could meet at the property? Say, 10 o'clock in the morning?" Daniel wanted to refuse, but curiosity won. He wanted to see what Harrison's great-granddaughter knew, what she wanted. And maybe, despite everything, he wanted to look her in the eye and decide for himself whether she deserved to know about the wealth her ancestor had deliberately hidden from her family. 10 o'clock works, Daniel agreed. After the call ended, Daniel sat in the dark office, listening to Lucas's peaceful breathing and the old building's nighttime sounds. Tomorrow would bring complications he wasn't prepared for, a confrontation between blood inheritance and earned discovery, between what was legal and what might be right. He thought about Harrison's portrait hanging in the hidden room, that stern, unyielding expression. What would the old man say if he could see his great-granddaughter coming to claim what he'd specifically denied her lineage? Would he approve of Daniel keeping the secret? Or would he expect something else? Daniel pulled out the journal again, reading Harrison's final entry by phone light. Let the land decide who is worthy. But the land hadn't decided anything. Chance had. Desperation had. Daniel had bought the cheapest available shelter and stumbled into someone else's vendetta against their own family. He looked at the second cache location on Harrison's map, the southern yard, near the old iron gate. Potentially easier to excavate than the first location. He could do it tomorrow before Victoria's visit, confirm whether the first cache was unique or part of a larger pattern. Or he could wait. See what Victoria wanted. Make decisions with more information than he currently possessed. Outside, wind rattled the foundry's windows, its voice carrying across the empty property like a warning. Daniel closed the journal and tried to sleep, knowing tomorrow would force choices he wasn't ready to make. Victoria Brennan Walsh arrived exactly at 10 o'clock, driving a silver SUV that looked aggressively out of place against the foundry's industrial decay. She emerged dressed in what Daniel recognized as expensive casual wear, the kind of clothing designed to look effortless while probably costing more than his monthly grocery budget. Early 40s, he guessed, with auburn hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail and the confident posture of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Lucas watched from the second-floor window as Daniel descended to meet their visitor. He'd told his son to stay inside during the conversation, a precaution that felt increasingly necessary as Victoria approached with the measured stride of someone assessing property value. "Mr. Carter," she said, extending a hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Her handshake was firm, professional. Daniel noted she wore a wedding ring, a simple gold band, and her eyes were already scanning the foundry's exterior with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. "Ms. Brennan Walsh," Daniel replied. "You said you wanted to discuss the property's history?" "Please, call me Victoria." She turned her full attention to him, and Daniel recognized the expression, assessment. She was trying to determine what kind of person she was dealing with, how much he might know, what leverage she might have. "My great-grandfather built this place. It's been in my family for over a century, even if we no longer own it." "Your family sold it," Daniel pointed out. "Several times, from what I understand. It went through at least 4 different owners before the county foreclosed." Victoria's jaw tightened slightly. "My uncle made decisions I didn't agree with. He saw the foundry as a burden, an unprofitable relic. He never understood what Harrison built here." Daniel gestured toward the building. "And what did Harrison build here, exactly?" Victoria turned to study the foundry, her expression shifting to something that might have been genuine nostalgia. "An empire, for a time. Harrison Brennan came to Pennsylvania with nothing in 1895. By 1920, he controlled steel contracts across 4 counties. He employed over 300 men at the operation's peak. Paid them fairly, treated them with respect. My great-grandfather believed in building something that would last, a legacy for his family. But it didn't last," Daniel said. "No." Victoria's voice carried bitter acknowledgement. "My grandfather Victor inherited ambition without skill, pride without vision. He spent 40 years slowly dismantling what Harrison built. Refused to modernize, refused to compete, refused to treat workers with dignity. And my father finished the job. By the time he sold this place, it was already a corpse." She turned back to Daniel. Which brings me to why I'm here. There are family stories about Harrison, things he may have left behind that weren't part of the official estate. There it was. Daniel kept his expression neutral. What kind of things? Victoria studied him carefully before responding. Harrison didn't trust banks. The financial panics reinforced that distrust. Family legend suggests he may have kept assets hidden on the property, insurance against economic collapse. My uncle dismissed these stories as fantasy, but I've done research. I've found references in old letters, cryptic mentions in journals. I believe the stories are true. And you want to search my property for your great-grandfather's hidden treasure? Daniel said flatly. I want to recover assets that rightfully belong to Harrison's bloodline, Victoria corrected. You purchased the building and land, Mr. Carter. No one disputes that. But if there are family assets hidden here, those weren't part of the sale. They remain family property. Daniel had anticipated this argument. That's not how property law works. I bought the land and everything on it. Anything found on the property belongs to me. Legally, perhaps, Victoria conceded. But morally? These are my family's assets, hidden by my great-grandfather for his descendants. The fact that my grandfather and father were too blind or lazy to find them doesn't change the fundamental ownership. And the fact that Harrison apparently hid them specifically so his son wouldn't find them? Daniel asked quietly. Does that change the fundamental ownership? Victoria's eyes widened slightly. What do you know about that? Daniel realized his mistake too late. He'd revealed knowledge that shouldn't be accessible to someone who'd only owned the property for 3 days. But backing down now would only make things worse. I found Harrison's hidden office, Daniel said. And I found his journal. I know exactly what he thought of his son, and why he hid what he hid. For a long moment, Victoria simply stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a sound without much humor, but genuine nonetheless. So you actually found it. The room everyone whispered about but no one could locate. How? My son has a talent for finding things that don't want to be found, Daniel said. Victoria's expression shifted, calculation replacing surprise. Then you know where the caches are located. You know what's buried here. I know what might be buried here, Daniel corrected. It was a lie, but a necessary one. Victoria didn't need to know about the war bonds currently reburied 16 feet south of the coal bin foundation. Mr. Carter, Daniel, I understand this puts you in a difficult position, Victoria said, her tone becoming more conciliatory. You purchased this property legally, and you have every right to anything you find here. But I'm asking you to consider the ethical dimensions. Harrison was my family. His wealth was built through generations of work. Does the fact that you happen to buy this building give you moral right to everything he accumulated? Does the fact that you share his blood give you moral right to wealth he specifically hid from his descendants? Daniel countered. Victoria flinched as if struck. You read what he wrote about my grandfather? I did. Victor was a difficult man, Victoria said quietly. Entitled, arrogant, dismissive of others. Everything Harrison wrote about him was probably true. But that doesn't define our entire family. I barely knew Victor, he died when I was 7. I'm not asking for this inheritance because I think I deserve it through some divine right of blood. I'm asking because I've spent my adult life trying to understand Harrison, trying to honor what he built in ways my grandfather and father never did. Daniel studied her, trying to gauge sincerity versus manipulation. What does that mean, honoring what he built? Victoria pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos before handing it to Daniel. The images showed historical documents, photographs, research materials. I'm a historian, Daniel. I specialize in early 20th century industrial development. I've written articles about Pennsylvania's steel industry evolution. Harrison's story is part of that history, and I've been documenting it for 12 years. Daniel scrolled through the images, academic papers bearing Victoria's name, photographs of Harrison at various stages of his life, copies of Foundry operational records. The research was extensive, genuine. So you want the money to fund more research? Daniel asked. I want the money because I'm 43 years old, recently divorced, teaching adjunct classes at 2 different colleges to make ends meet, and living in a rental apartment I can barely afford, Victoria said bluntly. I want it because I'm Harrison's great-granddaughter and I'm struggling while his wealth sits buried on properties sold off by people who never appreciated what they had. I want it because, yes, it would help me, and unlike my grandfather and father, I would actually do something meaningful with it. The raw honesty in her voice surprised Daniel. He'd expected legal arguments or emotional manipulation, not this direct acknowledgement of personal desperation. It was, he realized, something he could relate to, 2 people standing on opposite sides of an inheritance neither had expected, both struggling with circumstances beyond their control. I need time to think about this, Daniel said finally. Victoria nodded slowly. How much time? I don't know. A few days at least. And in the meantime, you'll what? Excavate what you can and then decide how much to share. Daniel met her gaze steadily. In the meantime, I'll read more of Harrison's journal, understand what he wanted, and try to figure out the right thing to do. Which is more consideration than you or your family gave this place for 70 years. Victoria absorbed this quietly. That's fair, she said eventually. More than fair, actually. She pulled a business card from her purse, handing it to Daniel. That's my number. When you're ready to talk, call me. And Daniel, thank you for not just telling me to leave. After Victoria departed, Daniel stood in the foundry's parking lot, turning her business card over in his hands. Dr. Victoria Brennan Walsh, Associate Professor of History. A scholar struggling to survive in academia's precarious economy, researching the legacy her own family had abandoned. The irony wasn't lost on him. Lucas emerged from the building, having apparently watched the entire conversation from his window perch. Was that lady mad? Not mad, Daniel said. Frustrated. Maybe disappointed. Is she going to take our treasure? Our treasure. Lucas had already claimed ownership in the simple, absolute way children understood possession. Daniel crouched down to his level. It's complicated, buddy. That lady is related to the man who hid the treasure. She thinks it belongs to her family. But we found it, Lucas said with perfect 9-year-old logic. And we bought the place where it was hiding. That makes it ours. Daniel wished adult morality were that straightforward. Sometimes what's legal and what's right aren't the same thing. I need to figure out which matters more. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the hidden office and read through Harrison's journal more carefully, looking for guidance the old man might have left. Most entries were factual, documenting each cache's location and contents. But scattered throughout were personal observations that revealed Harrison's philosophy. One entry, dated August 1918, stood out. Buried the first cache today, enough bonds to keep Margaret and the children comfortable if the economy fails again. Victor watched me work but asked no questions, showed no curiosity about why his father might be digging holes on his own property. The boy takes everything for granted, believes wealth appears through birthright rather than effort. He will inherit this business and likely destroy it. So be it. A man can only control what he can control. Another, from March 1943, the land remembers. Equipment I installed 30 years ago still functions because we maintained it properly. Men I employed in the 20s now send their sons to work here. What we build becomes part of something larger than ourselves. Victor sees only the immediate, the transactional. He will sell this all eventually, I have no doubt. But the land will remain. And maybe someone worthy will find what I've hidden and understand what it means. The land will remain. Daniel looked out the hidden office's narrow window at the acres of cracked concrete and dead weeds surrounding the foundry. Harrison had been right, the buildings had decayed, the family had scattered, but the land remained, unchanged by human drama. Daniel spent the next 3 days excavating the remaining 4 caches, working during the hours Lucas was at school. Each location yielded treasures similar to the first, war bonds, carefully preserved, representing wealth Harrison had systematically hidden over decades. The total was staggering, over $200,000 in original bond value, which with accumulated interest over 77 years could potentially be worth close to $1 million once he factored in redemption values. It was more money than Daniel had ever imagined possessing. Enough to provide Lucas with every opportunity he'd been denied: college education fully funded, a proper home instead of sleeping bags on office floors, security against every disaster life might throw at them. Everything a father could want for his son. But Harrison's words haunted him. Let the land decide who is worthy. On the fourth evening, Daniel called Victoria. She answered on the second ring, her voice tense with anticipation. "Victoria, I want to meet again," he said. "Tomorrow, if you're available. Somewhere neutral." "There's a diner in Millridge," Victoria said. "I know it. What time?" 2 o'clock. "Just you and me." Daniel arrived early, claiming a booth near the back where they could talk privately. Victoria appeared precisely at 2, sliding into the opposite seat with an expression that tried to mask desperation with professional composure. "Thank you for calling," she said. Marcus had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, trying different approaches in his mind. Direct honesty seemed like the only version that felt right. "I found all 5 caches," he said without preamble. The contents match Harrison's descriptions in his journal. Victoria's breath caught. "And? I've spent 4 days thinking about what's right, not what's legal, not what benefits me most." "What's right?" He pulled out his phone, showing her photographs he'd taken of the excavated boxes and their contents. "Your great-grandfather accumulated serious wealth. More than I initially realized." Victoria studied the images, her hand trembling slightly as she scrolled through them. "How much?" "Original bond value over $200,000. With accumulated interest and current redemption rates, probably close to $1 million. "My God," Victoria whispered. Daniel set his phone down. Harrison wrote that he wanted the land to decide who was worthy. But land doesn't decide anything. People do. So I'm deciding. He paused, making sure he had her full attention. "I'm keeping half." Victoria looked up sharply. "Half?" "Half," Daniel confirmed. "I purchased this property legally. I found these caches through my own effort and my son's curiosity. I need this money to give Lucas a stable life, opportunities he won't have otherwise. That's worth something." "And the other half?" Victoria asked carefully. "Goes to you. Not because you're entitled to it through blood, but because you're the only member of Harrison's family who actually cared about what he built. You've spent 12 years documenting his legacy while everyone else forgot he existed. That's worth something too." Victoria sat very still, processing this. "You're serious?" "Completely. We split it down the middle. You use your half however you want. I'll do the same. No legal fights, no arguments about who deserves more. Just a clean split between 2 people who both need help and both have reasonable claims." "That's extremely generous," Victoria said quietly. "It's pragmatic," Daniel corrected. "Fighting over this in court would cost both of us money and time neither of us can spare. This way, we both get enough to make real differences in our lives." Victoria studied him for a long moment. "You could have kept everything. I have no proof the caches exist, no legal standing to demand anything. You could have told me you found nothing, and I'd have no way to challenge it." "I could have," Daniel agreed. "But then I'd be exactly the kind of person Harrison was bitter about, someone taking what they didn't earn, claiming what they don't deserve. I'm not that person, and I don't want Lucas growing up thinking that's acceptable." Victoria's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "My great-grandfather would have liked you." "Maybe," Daniel said. "Or maybe he'd be furious I'm sharing with his bloodline at all. But I like to think he'd understand that sometimes the right answer is more complicated than absolute judgment allows." They worked out the logistics over the next 2 weeks. Daniel carefully documented each cache's contents, photographing and inventorying everything. Victoria brought in a discreet appraiser she'd worked with on historical projects, someone who could value the bonds without asking uncomfortable questions about their origin. The bonds alone totaled just over $850,000 in current redemption value, accounting for decades of accumulated interest. Split evenly, $425,000 each. Daniel opened his first real bank account in years, depositing his share in careful increments that wouldn't trigger suspicious activity reports. Victoria did the same, her hands shaking as she completed the paperwork that would end her years of financial precarity. They met one final time at the foundry, both of them standing in the hidden office where Harrison's portrait still hung. "I've looked at this portrait in photographs dozens of times," Victoria said. "But seeing it in person, in the room he designed to hide it, that's different." "You could take it," Daniel offered. "The portrait belongs with family." Victoria shook her head. "No. It belongs here, in the room he built. This is his real legacy, not the money. This secret office, these careful plans, this whole elaborate system he designed to outlast his disappointment. The portrait should stay where he put it." Daniel understood. Some things had value beyond ownership. For months later, Daniel stood in the foundry's main floor, watching contractors install new heating systems throughout the building. The space was being converted, not into a museum or historical site, as Victoria might have done, but into something Harrison probably would have appreciated more: mixed-use development. Workshop spaces on the ground floor for local craftspeople and small manufacturers. Affordable apartments on the upper floors, including the office Daniel and Lucas still occupied, now properly renovated with real furniture and actual walls. Lucas attended a good school now, driven there each morning in a reliable vehicle Daniel had purchased with cash. He'd joined the robotics club, started designing elaborate machines in his notebook that showed real engineering promise. The change in him was remarkable, as if financial stability had lifted a weight he'd been carrying without complaint. Victoria visited occasionally, combining trips to research Harrison's papers with informal friendship that had developed between them. She'd quit one of her adjunct positions, using her share of the inheritance to fund a book specifically about Harrison Brennan and the immigrant entrepreneurs who'd built Pennsylvania's steel industry, a real book with a major academic press that would cement her reputation and hopefully lead to a permanent position. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Victoria said during one visit, standing with Daniel in the renovated workshop space. "Harrison spent his whole life building something permanent, and his son destroyed it in a generation. But then you came along, and you're building again. Different vision, different purpose, but the same fundamental drive, creating something that will outlast you." Daniel looked around at the workshop spaces filling with equipment and supplies. A metalworker had leased one section. A woodworker another. A woman who made custom furniture occupied a third. All of them were people trying to build small businesses, create something lasting. "I don't think I'm that ambitious," Daniel said. "I just wanted a roof that didn't leak and enough money to give Lucas stability." "That's exactly what Harrison wanted," Victoria said. "Stability for his family, a legacy that would last." "You're more similar than you realize." Maybe she was right. Daniel had never thought of himself as a builder of legacies, just a father trying to survive. But standing here, watching people transform the space Harrison had created into something new yet connected to its past, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose beyond mere survival. That evening, after Victoria had departed and Lucas was asleep, Daniel returned to the hidden office one final time. He'd left it largely unchanged despite the renovations, preserving it as a kind of shrine to the man whose bitterness had accidentally saved Daniel's life. He looked up at Harrison's portrait, meeting those painted eyes that seemed to assess him across decades. "I hope I did right by you," Daniel said quietly. "I kept half, shared half. Tried to build something instead of just taking. Best I could figure." The portrait offered no response, but Daniel hadn't expected one. The conversation was for his benefit anyway, a way to acknowledge the weight of what he'd been given and what he'd tried to build with it. He thought about calling Victoria, sharing this moment of reflection with the one person who might fully understand it. But it was late, and some thoughts were better held privately, turned over in the quiet space where past and future met in the present moment. Instead, Daniel turned off the light and closed the hidden door, leaving Harrison to watch over the empty office in darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove himself worthy or fall short. But tonight, Daniel allowed himself something rare and precious. Tonight, he allowed himself to feel like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to work out after all. The foundry creaked around him as he walked to his renovated living quarters, old metal settling into the evening's dropping temperature. Lucas slept peacefully in his room, surrounded by engineering books and sketch pads filled with designs for the future. Outside, the Pennsylvania winter pressed close, but inside the building held warmth and purpose and the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered. Daniel paused at his son's doorway, watching him sleep as he'd done countless times over 9 years. All the desperate choices, all the unlikely discoveries, all the careful decisions about money and legacy and what constituted doing right, all of it had led to this moment. A sleeping child, safe and secure. A building brought back to life. A community built from abandoned space and hidden wealth. And the simple determination to make something good from what seemed irredeemably broken. The land will remain, Harrison had written. And Daniel understood now, in his bones, what that meant. People came and went. Fortunes rose and fell. Buildings stood and crumbled. But the land remained, witness to all of it, offering its blank slate to each new generation willing to work and build and try. Daniel Carter had proven willing. And in Harrison Brennan's hidden legacy, he'd found not just wealth, but purpose. Not just shelter, but home. Not just survival, but the possibility of something that might actually last. 5 years moved across the foundry property like seasons, each one leaving its mark in ways both visible and profound. The building that had once stood as a monument to abandonment now hummed with purposeful activity 6 days a week. The workshop spaces Daniel had created hosted 14 small businesses now, their combined energy transforming the massive structure into something Harrison Brennan might have recognized despite the changed purpose. Not steel casting anymore, but craft and creation, the fundamental work of building things that would outlast their makers. Lucas turned 14 in the spring of the 5th year, growing tall and lean in ways that sometimes caught Daniel off guard. He'd become something of a local figure, the kid who'd discovered a secret room and changed his family's fortune. The story had spread despite Daniel's attempts at discretion, transformed through teenage retelling into something more dramatic than reality. Lucas handled the attention with surprising grace, neither denying nor embellishing, simply existing as himself in ways that made Daniel proud beyond words. He developed a passion for mechanical engineering, spending hours in the workshop spaces learning from the metalworkers and machinists who'd leased Daniel's facilities. His notebooks were filled now not with imaginary machines, but with actual designs, improvements to equipment, solutions to manufacturing problems, theoretical modifications that showed genuine understanding of how things worked. Daniel kept those drawings in a folder in the hidden office, which remained preserved exactly as they'd found it, Harrison's portrait still watching over the small space with that stern, unyielding expression. Victoria visited quarterly now, her life transformed by the financial stability Harrison's inheritance had provided. She'd published her book about Pennsylvania's steel barons to critical acclaim, parlaying that success into a tenure-track position at a university in Pittsburgh. But she made time to return to Millridge, to walk the foundry property and document its evolution for what she called a companion study about legacy and reinvention. "You've created something remarkable here," she said during her spring visit, surveying the busy workshop floor where a furniture maker was explaining joinery techniques to a group of high school students Daniel had agreed to mentor. "This building is more alive now than it was even in Harrison's time." Daniel wasn't sure about that, but he appreciated the sentiment. "It's just people working. Same as it always was." "No," Victoria corrected gently. "It's community. Harrison ran a business. You've built an ecosystem. There's a difference." Maybe there was. Daniel had certainly never planned anything so grand. The workshop spaces had started as a way to generate income to cover the foundry's maintenance costs, but they'd evolved into something more organic, a place where craftspeople supported each other, shared equipment and expertise, created a network of mutual aid that extended beyond the building's walls into Millridge's broader community. Ray Patterson from the hardware store had become a regular presence, offering advice to the younger craftspeople and occasionally teaching classes on traditional metalworking techniques his own father had learned while working for Harrison. The circle completing itself in ways no one could have predicted. Daniel had expanded the residential units too, converting more of the second floor into affordable housing for artists and craftspeople who couldn't afford Millridge's slowly rising rents. Lucas's suggestion, actually, born from watching one of the welders struggle with the commute from across the county. 12 units now, all occupied, all contributing to the building's transformation from industrial relic to living community. The money from Harrison's caches had made all of it possible, but Daniel had been careful not to simply spend the windfall. He'd invested most of it, creating revenue streams that could sustain the foundry's operations without depleting the principal. His welding background had proven invaluable for the renovation work, allowing him to do much of the labor himself and stretch the budget further than professional contractors could have managed. He still thought about Harrison sometimes, wondered what the old man would make of what his hidden wealth had created. Not the legacy Harrison had probably imagined, but a legacy nonetheless. The Brennan name lived on in the building's informal title. Everyone called it the Brennan Workshops now, even though the property legally belonged to Daniel Carter. On a warm June evening, Daniel received an unexpected call from a lawyer in Pittsburgh. A formal voice, careful and precise, asking if he was the Daniel Carter who owned the former Brennan Foundry property. "That's me," Daniel confirmed, immediately wary. 5 years of legitimate ownership hadn't completely erased his anxiety about legal challenges to his claim. "I represent the estate of Victor Brennan Jr., the lawyer said. "Harrison Brennan's grandson. He passed away last month at the age of 91. Daniel remembered Victoria mentioning her father occasionally, always with a mixture of frustration and sadness. The man who'd finally sold the foundry after running it into irrelevance. Too proud to admit defeat, but too incompetent to prevent it. "I'm sorry for your loss," Daniel said automatically. "But I'm not sure why you're calling me." Mr. Brennan left specific instructions in his will regarding the foundry property, the lawyer explained. "He became aware in recent years of the property's revitalization under your ownership. Apparently, his daughter Victoria kept him informed, though they weren't close. He wanted you to have something." Daniel couldn't imagine what Victor Brennan would have left him. They'd never met, never even spoken. 3 days later, a package arrived via courier. Inside, wrapped in protective paper, was a photograph in an old wooden frame. The image showed the foundry in its prime, probably from the 1930s based on the vehicles visible in the background. Steel beams rose like cathedral columns around the building. Workers posed in organized rows before the main entrance. And standing prominently in the front row was Harrison Brennan himself, looking perhaps 30 years younger than in the portrait hanging in the hidden office. A letter accompanied the photograph, handwritten in shaky script that suggested it had been composed near the end of Victor's life. "Mr. Carter, I will never meet you, but my daughter Victoria tells me you are a man my grandfather would have respected. I was not such a man. I inherited my father's business without inheriting his character, his vision, or his dedication. I spent 40 years proving my unworthiness, destroying what he built through negligence and pride. By the time I understood what I'd lost, it was too late to recover it. Victoria tells me you found my grandfather's hidden wealth and chose to share it with our family despite having no legal obligation to do so. This act of generosity shames me. I could have searched for those caches myself in the decades I owned the property. I chose not to, dismissed the family stories as fantasy, refused to honor my grandfather's memory by actually trying to understand him. I am sending you this photograph because it represents what the foundry was meant to be, a place of work, purpose, and community. Victoria tells me you have recreated that in your own way. My grandfather hid his wealth from me because I didn't deserve it. You found it and proved yourself worthy through what you chose to build. I have no right to ask anything of you, but I make one request: remember that buildings are not legacies. People are. The foundry mattered because of the lives my grandfather touched, the families he supported, the community he helped sustain. If you remember nothing else about the Brennan name, remember that. Signed, Victor Brennan Jr. Daniel read the letter 3 times, trying to parse the emotion in those careful words. Regret, certainly. Shame. But also something like peace, an old man making what amends he could at the end of his life. He hung the photograph in the main workshop space where everyone who entered the building would see it. A reminder of what the place had been, what it could be again, what it was becoming. Several of the older craftspeople recognized the image, remembered stories their grandparents had told about working for Harrison Brennan when the foundry had been the valley's economic heart. Lucas studied the photograph with intense concentration, eventually pointing to a young man in the second row of workers. Do you think he had a family? Kids who grew up here? Probably, Daniel said. Most of them probably did. So their great-grandkids might still be around. They might walk past this building and not even know their family helped build it. It was exactly the kind of observation that made Daniel realize his son was growing into someone special. He saw connections, understood legacy in ways that transcended simple ownership. That summer, Lucas proposed a project for his 9th grade history class. He wanted to document the oral histories of families whose ancestors had worked at the foundry, preserving their stories before the last generation with direct memories passed away. Daniel helped him set up interviews, provided space in the workshop for recording sessions, watched with quiet pride as his son carefully drew out stories from elderly residents who remembered when the foundry's whistle had marked the rhythm of the entire valley's workday. Victoria visited specifically to participate in the project, bringing her academic expertise and research materials to supplement Lucas's interviews. Together, they assembled a collection of photographs, documents, and recorded memories that painted a fuller picture of Harrison Brennan's legacy than any single source could have provided. The portrait Daniel had found in the hidden office was just one version of Harrison, frozen in formal severity. The stories revealed someone more complex, a demanding boss, but fair. A man who'd fired workers for negligence but rehired them when their families faced hardship. An innovator who'd invested in safety equipment that protected workers even when cheaper options existed. Someone who believed that success meant lifting the community, not just extracting profit from it. He wasn't perfect, one 89-year-old man told Lucas during an interview. My grandfather said Harrison could be hard, sometimes cruel in his honesty. But he kept the foundry running through the Depression when other operations were closing. Kept men employed, families fed. That counted for more than whether he was pleasant about it. Lucas included that quote in his final presentation, understanding somehow that real legacy existed in complicated space between idealization and condemnation. People were flawed and still worthy of remembrance. Work could be hard and still meaningful. Legacy could survive even when direct descendants failed to preserve it. His history teacher gave him the highest grade in the class and submitted the project to a state competition where it won recognition that brought unexpected attention to the foundry's revival. A regional newspaper ran a feature story. A business magazine followed up with something more substantial. Suddenly, the Brennan workshops became known beyond Millridge, an example of rural reinvention that attracted visitors curious to see how an abandoned industrial building had become a thriving creative community. Daniel handled the attention with the same quiet competence he'd applied to everything else. He gave tours when asked, explained the building's evolution without embellishment, deflected questions about the found wealth that had funded the transformation. Some stories were private, meant for the people they directly affected rather than public consumption. But he did display Victoria's published book in the workshop's small library, a space Lucas had convinced him to create using one of the renovated second-floor offices. The book's dedication page read, "For Harrison Brennan, who built with purpose, and for Daniel Carter, who understood what that meant." Daniel had never thought of himself as someone who understood much beyond basic survival and hard work. But maybe that was enough. Maybe understanding legacy didn't require grand vision, just consistent effort toward building something larger than yourself. The 5th anniversary of purchasing the foundry arrived in November, marked by a small celebration the workshop community organized without Daniel's knowledge. They gathered in the main floor space after hours, craftspeople and residents and community members who'd become invested in the building's story. Ray Patterson gave a short speech about Harrison Brennan and the importance of remembering the valley's industrial heritage. Victoria spoke about legacy and reinvention, how places could hold meaning across generations if people cared enough to preserve and transform them. Lucas, at 14, stood before the assembled group and read from his history project, his voice steady as he described the connection between past and present, between Harrison's original vision and what his father had created. Daniel watched from the back, simultaneously proud and uncomfortable with the attention, relieved when the formal speeches ended and the gathering dissolved into informal conversation and shared food. Later, after everyone had departed and Lucas had gone to bed, Daniel stood alone in the workshop space, looking at the photograph Victor Brennan had sent him. The building looked so different in that old image, new, purposeful, surrounded by industry and activity that had seemed permanent until it wasn't. Nothing was permanent. Buildings decayed, businesses failed, families scattered. Even the land changed, though slowly enough that individual human lives couldn't perceive it. What persisted was the effort, the attempt to build something meaningful, to leave the world slightly better than you'd found it. Daniel had stumbled into this responsibility by accident, driven by desperation rather than vision. But 5 years of steady work had transformed accident into intention, desperation into purpose. The foundry was his now, in ways that transcended legal ownership. He'd earned it through sweat and careful choices, through honoring what had come before while building toward what might come next. He climbed the stairs to the hidden office one last time that night, a ritual he'd maintained over the years, visiting Harrison's portrait whenever gratitude needed expressing to someone who couldn't respond. The room remained exactly as they'd found it, preserved as a shrine to the complicated old man whose bitterness had accidentally created opportunity. 5 years, Daniel said quietly to the painted face. Lucas is thriving. The building's alive. We're making it work. He paused, considering what else to say. I hope that's enough. I hope it's what you wanted, or close to it. The portrait offered no response, but Daniel hadn't expected one. He turned off the light and closed the hidden door, leaving Harrison to watch over the empty office in darkness. Outside, the November wind carried the scent of approaching winter across the Pennsylvania hills. The foundry stood solid against the coming cold, its lights glowing warm in the darkness, its purpose renewed by people willing to work and build and try. Daniel Carter had proven willing. And in Harrison Brennan's hidden legacy, he'd found not just wealth, but home. Not just survival, but the possibility of something that might actually last. The land would remain, witness to all of it, offering its blank slate to each new generation brave enough to claim it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.